For the topic this week, we want to talk about tax deed risks and some of the risks that are associated with buying our favorite stuff, which is land. It isn't without its risks. You know, there are risks that are there. It's important to recognize exactly what those risks are, and then also how we can avoid, how we can avoid them and how we can avoid making mistakes.
Yeah, well, if you've followed any of me and Shade's trainings before, we always talk about tax sales or tax sale properties having two things, having number one use and also having value. And so when we're talking about tax deed land, it needs to have a use, especially if it's going to be a buildable property, residential property, even commercial property. It needs to be a buildable property. And so one of the major risks that people can have in buying property or buying land in particular is buying land that isn't usable because it doesn't fit within the zoning requirements of that city.
Yeah, easily one of the biggest risks that we always face with land is, you know, some of the best opportunities we're going to find will be with land in tax sales. But the flip side of that is that the biggest risk that we face is useless land. And so there is, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference from looking just at the outside whether land is going to be useless or whether land is going to be a good investment. And so there are certain things that we can check and that we need to check. Anytime we're looking at potentially buying property. In fact, and we do these buying tours on a regular basis. And every time we do a buying tour, uh, you know, we need to check all of these different things in order to determine that land is usable. That it's not a useless piece of land. And so we're going to talk about how we can determine that. And I guess it goes into greater depth than just comparing it to the lots around it, because sometimes that's not enough. Zoning things can change over time, and so we want a definitive answer on things on whether property is usable or not. And so this is how we're gonna help you find it.
Yeah, well, in looking at it, the minimum lot size is really going to be the minimum amount of square footage or size that's required to be able to be built, or to be able to build on that area. And so that's usually going to be set by the city's codes or the town's codes. If it's located in more in a rural area or within the country, then the county, then it could be the county that we need to go to. But if we're looking at a property that's located in the city or a town, it's usually the town that we're going to need to go to find out exactly what that minimum lot size is.
Yeah, every single small local government has its own set of laws and ordinances. Basically, they cover everything, including what property can be used for, and essentially, what property can be used for, and then things that you can do with property beyond that. And so, um, yeah, it's important to understand, I guess, who exactly has jurisdiction over the property when it comes to something like zoning. Because in other words, if you're looking for zoning stuff under the county and the property, is within a city, you're not going to find the answers that you're looking for because you're looking in the wrong place. You need to be able to look, first find the right jurisdiction, and then, you can start to look for the correct zoning information.
Yeah, and as we're looking at an overhead map of the property on the county GIS maps, we'll look at the size of the surrounding lots to at least give us an idea, but we can't assume that because the lot next to it has a home on it, that this lot is still buildable, because laws could have changed when that property was initially built.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is something that laws, ordinances change all the time. I mean, they're passed with a simple vote. They can change with a simple vote, and so we need definitive information about the property. And so, yeah, in fact, sometimes it's a challenge trying to figure out exactly where the property falls under. But usually, we can determine that when we're looking at at the assessed record on the property, and we're looking at, for instance, its address, where it's located at. Sometimes it's included in the address. Sometimes it's not. We have to dig a little bit deeper to figure out which jurisdiction it's going to be within. And if we get lost, one of the easiest ways to find out is just to call up the city, or the county to find out. In fact, if there's any question about which jurisdiction it falls under, then that's the kind of question that they can answer pretty well.
Yeah, and I would say more often than not, the property is going to be located within some type of city or township or something like that. And so usually it's going to be the city jurisdiction, but that's not always the case. There is going to be county land, and so that case we're going to need to contact the county. And like Shade mentioned, we can always contact the city and find out exactly from them. They're really going to be a great resource that we use not only in our own investing when we teaching our coaching students, or even like Shade talked about when we go out on our buying tours with our students, where we attend one of these auctions. We're going to be going through that same process of contacting the city to find out additional information.
Yeah, in fact, we have to first figure out which jurisdiction, I guess, which municipality or which government entity has jurisdiction over the property. But once we know that, then we can begin to look for the actual zoning ordinances or for the laws and how it's written out. And so, um, in fact, what we're going to look at here is what you'll find on in most cases here when you're dealing with these, and that is there's generally a village or a city or a town website where they'll have information, maybe some information listed about zoning or a place where you can do stuff with zoning. But then there is a directory, a code directory that's completely separate, and that is where you're going to find specific answers. That's kind of like the laws, and as they're written. Versus the county website that's there to answer questions. So we can find some answers on the website, but a lot of times though where we're going to find specific answers will be in the actual directory.
Yeah, and a lot of times we're going to pull up both of them when we're doing a Google search. So in this case, you can see that we were looking up, an area in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. So we type Pine Bluff, Arkansas zoning lot size, but we can use a number of different keywords, as you can see over there on the left-hand side, whether that's building lot code or minimum lot size, district code. Any combination of these with zoning should be able to pull up information not only connected to the city website, but also, like Shade talked about, any of those directory codes directories that have all of the codes available, kind of like the example here.
Yeah, in fact, so this, if you had clicked on the city website, that's what this pulls up here. So for Pine Bluff, this is their page on zoning, and we can actually look and see there is a link there to a zoning map that helps us see how the city is broken down and what areas. And sometimes we can find our answers there with the zoning map, by locating our property there on the map and seeing how it's zoned there. But this is also where you do things like filing for a zoning appeal, or if you wanted to try to get the property rezoned, this is where you would apply for that. And so there are uses here for this. But if we're trying to figure out exactly how many square footage or what the minimum square footage is for R1 residential, then what we need there are the actual the book of ordinances or the code, so that we can read what that definition is.
Yeah. Well, and here's kind of an example of the Code of Philadelphia. In fact, we were doing a training a couple of weeks ago with some of our advanced members, and we were looking at a bunch of different maps like this and determining where the properties were located based on these color code maps. Because if we're looking at a map like this, each one of those colors are going to be connected to a code, whether that be R1 or R2, or C1 for commercial, whatever their codes are within that district. We can use these maps to determine where the property is located, and then from the map determine exactly what the code is going to be located for that, the code for that particular property.
Yeah, zoning maps can be helpful in that way. Something else that is interesting that you'll find sometimes with zoning maps is this. This was actually on the Pine Bluff, Arkansas zoning map, which is a black and white map, but it still has them broken down into areas. It just doesn't quite look as nice. But down, up in the corners, they have these areas here, which there's one on the top and one there on the bottom. But what you'll notice here is they have the name, they have the number of the ordinance listed there, the date adopted, and who it was changed by. And they have to list those because, again, the laws are constantly changing over time, and that's why why you could have a lot that may have been deemed usable when the lot was developed, or when the land was developed, 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, whatever it was. It's why you can have a lot that was usable at that time, but suddenly it's no longer usable, and it's because they changed the ordinances there at some point and changed what that definition was.
Yeah, I mean, Shade really brings up a good point because we've seen that happen where, in fact, I was looking at somewhere just recently where the code had changed in 2018. And so a property that was usable in 2018, they had changed the code to where it was no longer usable. And if we would have noticed that additional addendum and be able to go look at that, we could have easily purchased that lot, or recommended the student to purchase the lot that, had that type of code issue against it, or the code change, I guess I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other option that we were talking about, one of them was the city or town website, and zoning information there. But the other one was the actual code of, or uh, the library, essentially. And so in this case, if we're looking at the library, uh, we can see here that chapter 29 is what's dedicated to zoning. And so, it helps to find and know exactly where that's at. And sometimes we can determine that in part of the search, tell us there what chapter. But from inside the chapter, though, we can see that there are a number of different articles here. And what we're looking for, first they have district generally, and then district regulations, and that's kind of what we're looking for, is district regulations, which are going to tell us what the regulations are for each one of these districts. And that's also where we can see how they break down their classifications, or the different zoning, different zonings that they have.
Yeah, well, and as you can see over there on the far left-hand corner, you can see the different chapters there. So there's when we're pulling up these codes, we can be we're pulling up the entire code for all of the city laws. So within there, you'll have things, as you can see, administration and aviation, animals, buildings. In this case, what we're really looking for, like Shade said, is that zoning information. Once we've zoned in, once we found that zoning section or zoning ordinance section, then from there we're looking, like Shade said, for that district regulation and the district zoning map, because those are going to coordinate together.
Yeah, so here, we can see the district regulations, and this gives us a full breakdown here of what each one of their zoning classifications are. So we can see, and this is something also, by the way, that this varies from town to town, city to city. It's not, nothing about this is universal, and so in most cases, maybe it's R1 for residential, but not everywhere. Sometimes they use different stuff. Most of the time, though, R1 is considered residential, but commercial isn't always called commercial. Commercial sometimes is called business in some places. Like I think in here it's called business is basically what they B, and they also have industrial. But then they break it down from light industrial to heavy industrial. Uh, you know, and then you've got also recreational areas you can see down there, and agricultural down there at the very bottom. And so again, you're going to have property types here that will cover every type of property within the county.
Yeah, and these codes are going to go ahead and match up with that zoning map that we were looking at earlier. So, even that one per Pine Bluff, this same area was a black and white, but there we're going to have those same code listings, and we're going to have to, like Shade said, go to the individual cities because these codes can change quite a bit. Now, once we get, once we've looked at the zoning map, then we're going to try to look at those different district regulations. So in this case, we can see that this is R1 residential, and we can see a couple of things about it. We can see that it can use single family homes, but we also see what's most important, and what we're looking for is the buildable size. And so with this property, it needs to have a 60-foot width at the building line, and it needs to be at least 7,200 square feet.
Yeah, which so if we're 60 feet wide and 7,200 square feet, which is not very big. That's maybe what is that? Maybe 0.15 of an acre, roughly. I'm guessing here. Um, but a relatively easy number to come up with too, if we're not sure exactly what it is, um, just by multiplying that length by the width. So let's take a look now. That may be so. For instance, if our property was zoned as R1, then that may give us the answer right there that we need. So as long as it's 60 feet wide and is 7,200 square feet, then it meets that minimum requirement and it will be considered usable. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there are additional things that we need to consider, or there's additional requirements. Um, the main point is being able to find exactly what those requirements are so that we know if the property we're looking at is going to meet them or not. Yeah, in this case, it's nice to have specific numbers, like to know it has to be at least this width and it has to be this number of square feet. And aside from that, most properties will work.
Yeah, exactly. So with an R1 property, if it was, 7,200 feet and at least to have a 60-foot width or 60-foot frontage, we'd be okay to go. Now on R2 property, we can see that that's changed a little bit. And this, we've actually can have a buildable lot if it has a 50-foot width and only a 5,000 square foot area. So with R2, we even have more flexibility, or we can even have a smaller lot and be able to build on it. But if the property was zoned, R1, if it was this size, if it was 5,000 feet, but it was in an R1 area, we couldn't build on it. But if it is an R2 in this size, then you could build on it.
Yeah, you'll also notice that the number of potential uses begins to change as properties, as the numbers change. You'll see different uses and different property types that that can be included here, and they generally go down in requirement because they're moving towards more of I don't know what you would call it, but more. Well, more flexibility, but also housing that is more condensed. What is it? So, rather than needing quite so much space, you're talking more about things like condos and things like apartment setups, where again, they don't need to have quite the same requirement because they allow for different types of buildings as well. And that's what we start to see as the codes change.
Well, and that can make a big difference if we're buying a larger piece of land. If we're just buying a small lot that's within an area, then we can get a good idea of within a neighborhood, we can figure out, okay, is this buildable or not? But as we're looking at bigger pieces of land, that's where some of those other uses can actually bring up the value of the property. Now here, I think we're looking at is this R4? Yeah, R4. So we've gone down a little bit more, but here it even has a smaller amount with a 40-foot width and a 4,800 square foot use.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, we can see how the requirements are shrinking, as it goes up here in scale. Also, one of the things that changes, so here it's only being 40 feet, which is not that much, and 4,800 square feet, which is fairly small. We're talking about a tenth of an acre or so. But also this in R4, it allows for modular homes, or manufactured homes as well, which is something that it wasn't allowed if it was an R1 or R2 or R3. So it takes an R4 in order to be able to put a manufactured or modular home there.
Yeah, that's going to be an important thing to look at. In fact, mobile homes, we love buying mobile home lots, or lots that are mobile home friendly or allow mobile homes, because you'll find a lot of people that are looking to be able to buy a lot and put their mobile home, their their modular home, their manufactured home, whatever it is, on that lot. But zoning can be pretty picky about it in some of these cities, and they won't allow it except for within a certain area. So, when these lots do come available, we pick them up, especially ones that may have already had a mobile home there before, because those could essentially be improved where maybe they have already got, utilities there, some form of utility, maybe a septic tank or hooked to the sewer, whatever it is. If they've already had a home there, mobile home there, and maybe have moved off, well, at least we know that they had utilities there at the lot.
Oh yeah, there's a significant investment, in order to take a lot from being just a basic vacant lot to making it, to getting it set up for a mobile home. I mean, Steve mentioned one of the things there, a septic system. In some cases, there are some areas where properties will have access to a sewer from the city, but in a lot of cases, with these properties, they don't. And so, there's requirements for something like a septic system, or even if they have sewer, it's a matter of getting it connected, which has, is a big expense all by itself. But then it's also things like getting the electrical out there and water. A person can spend quite a bit of money to get all of that set up. And so if we can buy a lot like that, it's had a pretty big investment into it. I mean, you can imagine somebody putting $20,000 into the lot to improve it. It's that kind of money that we're talking about. And so anytime, even if there's nothing there, even if there is no trailer there, but it was set up for a trailer at one point, that has tremendous value because somebody put a lot of money into it.
Yeah, well, and you could flip it and resell it to somebody who wants to put their trailer on it, or you could look at buying a manufactured home, whether it be used or new, and put that on the property, and suddenly now you're essentially selling a structured property, a usable property, or you could also use it as a rental. So that could be a great way to start earning rental income by putting some type of manufactured home on that lot, getting it all hooked up, and then renting it out, where you've essentially were able to pick up the land for probably pretty dirt cheap. And so really your cost is going to be, or probably more majority of the cost will be in getting that mobile home to the lot. But then you've got automatically got a structured property that could bring as much rental income as trying to build a whole house, but with very minimal cost.
Yeah, not only that, but we're also talking about the lowest price of entry level housing, which is always going to be easy to sell. I mean, when you're dealing with the most inexpensive housing, there's always going to be a line of buyers, that want to pick it up from you. You'll never have a problem moving property. When it comes to stuff that's at the lower end of the price spectrum. And so, and that's what mobile homes represent. They're the entry point there for housing. And so, yeah, they are the perfect type of lot to go after. Now, um, the main points here is that generally we can, I guess, when we're looking at lots, uh, value and use tend to go hand in hand. So most of the time, if a property has good value associated with it, if the county gives it a good high value, it's because the property has use. And so, that use tends to follow the value. But sometimes you'll come across a lot and the county has a very low value attached to it. And that also follows use, because a lot of times that means that the property is not big enough to be used. And therefore, it's going to have some value attached to it, but it may be very small value, reflecting its inability to be used for anything. And so we can usually point out, or these types of properties usually stick out to us. But it's important that we identify them ahead of time so that we don't buy something, with the expectation that it's usable, only to find out later that it's not.
Yeah, well, it's amazing how many times we see not our students, but at auctions that we're attending, at auctions with our students, that are investors are buying property that we know is not usable, we know is not buildable, because we've gone through that extra research, through those extra steps to make sure that we know exactly what is usable and what isn't. Even with us going out almost every single month with our students attending an auction, we're going through this process with them where when you attend that auction or you're bidding online, you really have a good idea of what is usable or not, so you don't make mistakes, because we see people make mistakes all the time. In fact, I think even later in today's episode, we're going to look at a couple of bad deals, and those were lots that were essentially, not usable, and that can just completely affect it. You've essentially thrown your money away.